All right, and the last article we're going to talk about is titled Occupational versus Leisure Time Physical Activity and Mortality. This is Conan et al. From 2024 here. And overall, what is happening here? Well, this was a meta-analysis of over 590,000 participants from 22 studies that were looking at differential effects on occupational physical activity and leisure time physical activity on all-cause mortality. So what they were looking for here is occupational physical therapy is activity at work, right? The things you do, moving around, doing your job, whereas leisure time is just that. In your leisure, going out and doing things. And they looked at various studies that were published in the literature already. So, and they had to have activity levels measured in some way, shape, or form, whether that was through activity monitors, which there weren't a lot of studies in there, or from just self-reported things. And overall, they looked at all-cause mortality, but they weren't specifically looking at those two. It's just kind of like grouping together. Oh, this one had this and this, so we'll use that. But it wasn't a prospective study looking at physical activity and mortality. It was a retrospective, but a meta-analysis kind of bringing them all together. And how do they divide them? Well, here's essentially what they broke them down into. The occupational physical activity groups, they had sedentary, low, moderate, high. Sedentary is work that just involves sitting. So you're just at a desk. So a lot of people, including physicians these days, a lot of times we're just sitting there doing things. But low levels, work that involves standing or walking around, maybe retail, hospitality. Moderate, carrying lighter objects or walking upstairs, factory, warehouse, we're thinking with that. Whereas high is a physically demanding work involving frequent carrying or lifting heavy loads, construction, manual labor like that. So that's how they broke down occupational. Whereas leisure time, sedentary is you just sit on the couch. You're not doing anything. You get home and you're just sedentary. Low level is occasionally getting in there, such as slow walking, maybe household activities. I never understand that as a side note when they say household activities. It's like what, like, so anyway, who's not a hoarder and just like doesn't do anything, that doesn't mean anything. Like everyone does household activities. Regardless, that's low level. Moderate level engagement activities like brisk walking or dancing, and high levels in regularly engaging in more strenuous activities like jogging, cycling, swimming, or just pretty much working out. And what were the main findings? Well, the main findings for leisure time physical activity, this was consistently associated with lower all-cause mortality in both men and women. And so once again, the more leisure time physical activity you had, the lower chance you had of dying is really what it came down to. And what was kind of interesting, I thought here, was higher levels of leisure time physical activity reduce mortality risk significantly with hazard ratios of 0.85 in the low group, 0.78 in the moderate, 0.75 in the high compared to sedentary. So what this means, so we talk about hazard ratios 1 second. Well, the hazard ratio measures the risk of death for different levels of physical activity compared to the reference group. So in this case, sedentary. So they looked at low versus sedentary, moderate versus sedentary, high versus sedentary, and they found that they had 0.78, 0.85, 0.78, and 0.75. And what that means is, so even the lowest group, just doing low, still had a 15% less and lower risk of death, whereas the next group up had 22%, and the highest group had a 25% lower risk of death. That's pretty substantial when compared to that. So for leisure time, even just doing something gets you pretty substantial benefits. It's about 15%. If you can go more than that, then that's great. And kind of like our last paper we talked about, it also had substantial effects. So the more you do, probably the better. Whereas occupational physical activity is kind of interesting. In contrast, higher levels of occupational physical activity were associated with increased mortality risk in men, but not necessarily women. This is weird. We're going to talk about it, but higher levels of this physical activity in the occupation showed an increased risk of mortality in men with a hazard ratio of 1.12, suggesting a paradox somehow where physically demanding work may not, confer the same health benefits as leisure time physical activity. So once again, these people who had high occupational physical activity were 12% more likely to die. And why is that? Well, they kind of coined it the physical activity paradox, where they're kind of guessing what it is. Really, we don't know why, right? These are observational. We have no idea, but they're kind of guessing. One theory they place is that occupational physical activity is often associated with repetitive, non-rewarding tasks, may contribute to repetitive, injuries on the body or wear and tear, quote unquote, rather than rejuvenating effects, which voluntary engaging leisure time activity has. So, when you go exercise, you feel better. If you do it all day, every day, repetitive task, it may wear you down. That's one thing. But I think what a big thing is, probably one of the bigger things, is the socioeconomic factors, right? So things like lower education income may also play a big role. And so a lot of times, more physically demanding jobs, people who do those are typically in lower socioeconomic classes and statuses. And so that may play a huge factor, that it's not even anything to do with their jobs. It's just the rest of their life, the risk factors that they have. And so that's something we need to consider. And I think just taking this for face value, what the, take home point would be for physicians is, hey, we need to talk about public health messages, promoting physical activity, and differentiating between leisure time and occupational, physical activity. And tailored advice might be beneficial for workers in physically demanding jobs, saying, hey, we should try to do some, leisure time activity, maybe important. And it's hard to, but at the end of the day, it's really hard to definitively say what's going on here. But I think it kind of helps clarify things in general, that like leisure time may be the key, right? We need to counsel patients intentionally about physical activity, and that need to be intentional about that. And that may be helpful. However, like this study definitely had limitations in terms of it was mostly Western affluent societies. And it was, that's just that study population. And the biggest thing for me, like if I had to take away from this, it's not necessarily like, oh, you get no benefit from physical activity, because your body won't know, like if you take 10,000 steps working versus leisure time, I don't think there's a physiologic way of knowing that, unless, like I said, their proposed mechanism is like, well, when you're at work, you're incurring much more stress. This movement is with stress and it's not rejuvenating. So once again, that's a theory. Definitely not saying that's definitively it. And so if that is true, then I could see why we see that discordance here. But overall, it's kind of a tricky one. But if I had to guess, just betting, completely random conjecture by me, but I think socioeconomic status probably has more to play in this than we think, in terms of the people who are more physically active at their jobs, maybe lower socioeconomic status. And what does that entail? Well, that entails less money for, quality healthcare, for activities, for leisure time itself, for they might live in food deserts. There's just so many reasons, pollution, you literally name it, and you're at a worse outcome by having lower socioeconomic status. And so that's a big, big confounder. But either way, I thought it was very interesting.